Hey guys, tonight we embark on a journey, not to a land of myth or fantasy, but to a time when our world was a very different place, a world teetering on the edge of an abyss it couldn't even imagine. We're setting our sights on the mid-14th century, a period that might seem quaint from our distant future, full of knights, castles, and perhaps a distinct lack of reliable Wi-Fi. Picture yourself standing on a muddy track somewhere in England or France, or perhaps the sprawling Holy Roman Empire. The air, the air. It's a rich tapestry of scents: damp earth, wood smoke from 100 hearths, the fragrance of baking bread, the distant earthy aroma of livestock, and, depending on the wind and your proximity to the local tanner, something that might make your nose hairs curl just a little. Church bells, the ever-present soundtrack of medieval life, toll in the distance, measuring out the hours of a day lived by the rhythm of the sun and the seasons. Life is a mixture of relentless toil, simple faith, and vibrant community, all about to be shattered by an invisible enemy. And let's be brutally honest here. If you, with all your 21st century sensibilities and a pampered immune system that's never had to truly fight for its life, were suddenly plonked into this era just as the main event kicks off, you probably won't survive this. Seriously, the odds would be spectacularly against you. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It's a small click for you, but it makes a huge difference to the channel. And, as always, I'd love to know where you're settling in from tonight and what time it is in your part of the world. Go ahead and drop that in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is, let's say, 1346, a year that still breathes with an air of normalcy, a deceptive calm before the storm of storms. You are living in what historians call the High Middle Ages, or perhaps the very late stage of it, depending on which academic you corner at a medieval-themed party. Europe, after the so-called Dark Ages, has been experiencing a period of growth, a reawakening of sorts. Towns have been swelling, trade routes expanding, and the population has boomed, thanks in no small part to a warmer climate for a few centuries and some agricultural innovations. But don't picture gleaming metropolises and scientific enlightenment. Life for most is still a very local, very earthy affair. If you're like the vast majority of people, upwards of 90%, your existence is rooted in the countryside. You are a peasant, a villain, a serf, bound to the land owned by a lord, either secular or ecclesiastical. Your days begin before dawn, not with the jarring shriek of a smartphone alarm, but with the crowing of the rooster, nature's own, slightly judgy wake-up call. You'd stumble out of your small, probably 1- or 2-room cottage, made of wattle and daub, a fancy term for woven sticks plastered with mud and dung, with a thatched roof that provides excellent insulation and an occasional home for enterprising rodents. Not exactly Architectural Digest material, but it's home. Your family sleeps close, perhaps sharing warmth with a few favorite animals in the harshest part of winter. Privacy is a luxury yet to be invented for your social stratum. Your life revolves around the agricultural calendar, a relentless cycle of plowing, sowing, weeding, and harvesting. The dominant system for tilling the land is the three-field system, a rather clever innovation that became widespread in the preceding centuries. This is a mainstream historical fact. One field would be planted with wheat or rye in the autumn, a second with spring crops like oats, barley, or legumes, peas and beans, fantastic for fixing nitrogen in the soil, though you wouldn't know why, only that it worked. And the third field would be left fallow, unplanted to recover its fertility. This system was a significant step up from older two-field systems, increasing food production and providing a bit more security against crop failure. It helped feed that booming population we mentioned. Still, farming with the tools available, heavy wooden plows, often needing a team of oxen to pull, sickles, scythes, is backbreaking labor. The excitement of turnip season is probably the highlight of your agricultural year. Okay, maybe not, but root vegetables were a staple. Your diet consists mainly of coarse dark bread, rye or barley, mostly, pottage, which was a thick vegetable and grain stew that was the medieval equivalent of a perpetual soup, constantly simmering, some cheese, ale or cider, water wasn't always safe to drink, and meat only on rare festival occasions unless you were skilled at poaching, which came with its own rather severe set of risks.
While most people are rural, towns and cities are growing in size and importance. If you're an urban dweller, your life is different, but not necessarily easier. You might be an artisan, a weaver, a smith, a cooper, a baker, belonging to a guild that regulates your trade, sets prices, and ensures quality. Or you could be a merchant, perhaps involved in the burgeoning wool trade or importing exotic goods like spices and silks from afar. Urban centers are crowded, vibrant, and incredibly unsanitary by our standards. Streets are narrow, often unpaved, winding alleys between closely packed timber-framed houses whose upper stories might jut out, creating a permanent twilight in the lanes below. There's no organized waste disposal system. People toss their household refuse, including the contents of chamber pots, directly into the street or the nearest waterway. Pigs, dogs, and chickens roam freely, acting as a sort of freelance and, frankly, overwhelmed sanitation department. The smell, especially in summer or in trades like tanning, which involves a lot of urine and decaying animal matter, could be potent enough to knock a buzzard off well, you get the idea. It's a miracle they didn't invent smelling salts just to walk down the street. Socially, you live in a highly stratified world. The feudal system, though evolving, still largely defines relationships. At the top are the nobility, kings, dukes, earls, knights, who own the land and provide military protection, in theory. Then there's the powerful clergy, from the pope and bishops down to the humble parish priest, who hold immense spiritual and temporal power. And then there's everyone else, the commoners, the workers. Social mobility is extremely limited. You are born into your station, and there you largely remain. Chivalry, with its elaborate codes of conduct for knights, is a prominent ideal, though how much it was practiced in daily life versus romanticized in literature is another question. Probably about as much as a modern code of conduct on an internet forum. The church is the single most dominant institution in your life. Its cathedrals, magnificent stone structures, often taking centuries to complete, tower over towns, symbols of God's power and human devotion. The church calendar dictates your year, feast days, fast days, holy days that provide welcome breaks from toil. The sacraments mark every stage of your life, from baptism to last rites. The local parish priest is your spiritual guide, your confessor, and often one of the few literate people in your village. The church provides what healthcare exists, often through monastic infirmaries, though their approach is a blend of herbal remedies, prayer, and resignation to God's will. Education, too, is largely the preserve of the church. For most, the world is understood through the lens of Christian doctrine. God is all-powerful, life on earth is a test, and the afterlife is eternal. What about your health, even before any new terrifying diseases arrive? Life expectancy is short, perhaps 30 to 35 years on average, skewed by very high infant and child mortality. If you survive childhood, you might live into your 50s or 60s, but you'd likely be worn down by hard labor and chronic ailments. Common diseases include dysentery, influenza, typhus, smallpox, and leprosy, though lepers were usually isolated in leper houses. Childbirth is a perilous event for both mother and child. Medical understanding is based on the ancient Greek theory of humors, as we mentioned. An imbalance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile is thought to cause disease. Treatments involve trying to rebalance these humors through bloodletting, purging, specific diets, and herbal remedies. Surgery is rudimentary and often fatal due to infection. One quirky tidbit relating to health and belief is the practice of the king's touch. It was widely believed, particularly in England and France, that the monarch, by divine right, could cure scrofula, a nasty tubercular infection of the lymph nodes in the neck, often called the king's evil, simply by touching the afflicted person during a special ceremony.
Thousands would line up for this royal treatment, a testament to the blend of faith, superstition, and desperation that characterized medieval approaches to illness. Travel and communication in your world are slow and arduous. Roads are often mere muddy tracks, dangerous due to bandits or wild animals. Most people never venture more than a few miles from their birthplace their entire lives. News travels at the speed of a horse or a ship, meaning information from distant lands is rare, often outdated, and frequently distorted into legend. The carrier pigeon express was probably quite reliable, unless the pigeons decided to unionize or encountered a particularly hungry hawk. This limited worldview means your concerns are intensely local: the weather, the harvest, the health of your family and livestock, the demands of your lord. Yet, despite this local focus, the world is also becoming more interconnected. The Crusades have broadened horizons for some. Trade routes like the Silk Road to the distant East and maritime networks across the Mediterranean and North Sea are bringing goods, ideas, and, as we will see, dangers. There's an intellectual ferment in the universities, with scholars grappling with theology and Aristotelian philosophy. Yet, beneath this surface of growth and activity, there are signs of strain. The population boom of previous centuries may have outstripped the capacity of the land to support it in some areas. The early 14th century saw a period of climatic cooling, sometimes called the Little Ice Age, leading to failed harvests and devastating famines, most notably the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, which killed millions and weakened many more. This leads to a significant open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether Europe in the early 14th century was already in a state of crisis due to overpopulation, resource depletion, and this climatic downturn, making it more vulnerable to the plague, or if it was a period of relative, if strained, prosperity and resilience that was simply overwhelmed by an unprecedented biological catastrophe. Was Europe a sturdy tree about to be hit by lightning, or was it already a bit rotten at the core? The truth likely lies somewhere in between, varying by region. So, this is your world in 1346, a world of faith and fear, community and hardship, a world intimately connected to the soil and the seasons. It's a world that believes in saints and demons, in the power of relics and the wisdom of ancient Greek physicians. It's a world utterly unprepared, intellectually and immunologically, for what is about to befall it. The grand, complex, and often contradictory tapestry of medieval life is about to be ripped apart. For now, you go about your day, perhaps with a prayer on your lips for a good harvest or good health, unaware that the whispers from the distant East, carried on ships and dreams of profit, are growing louder, drawing ever closer, bringing with them a darkness that will engulf your known world.
Those whispers from the distant East, the ones you in your European village can barely conceive of, are born in lands so remote they might as well be the stuff of legend. Places beyond the maps that even the most learned scholars in your world possess. To truly understand the shadow now creeping towards your doorstep, you must cast your mind far, far away from the familiar fields of wheat and the comforting chime of your local church bell. We need to journey eastward, across formidable mountain ranges, arid deserts, and immense windswept grasslands, to the heart of the great Asian continent. It is here, in these vast, sparsely populated territories, that the seeds of the Black Death were sown, not in the year 1346, but likely decades before. A slow burn before the eventual conflagration. Imagine yourself now, not amidst the green rolling hills of England or the vineyards of France, but on the high steppes of Central Asia. Picture the stark beauty of the Tian Shan Mountains, their peaks perpetually capped with snow, or the seemingly endless expanse of the Gobi Desert. Or perhaps you find yourself near the shores of Lake Issyk-Kul, a vast, brackish lake nestled high in what is now Kyrgyzstan. This region, a sprawling territory of present-day Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, western China, and Mongolia, is widely considered by many scientists and historians to be if not the primary natural reservoir for Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes plague. This is a key mainstream historical fact. Yersinia pestis lives a quiet, unassuming existence within populations of wild rodents. Think of huge colonies of marmots, those rather chunky, oversized ground squirrels, or smaller gerbils, voles, and other burrowing creatures. They are the natural hosts, often living with a low level of infection that doesn't necessarily wipe out their entire population. It's a long-established, if uneasy, equilibrium. The cute, furry marmots in particular, often hunted for their fur or meat, could be carrying enough pestilence in their bloodstreams to eventually rearrange global demographics. Nature truly has its little surprises, doesn't it? The bacterium is transmitted between these rodents by their fleas. A flea bites an infected rodent, ingests the bacteria, which then multiply in the flea's gut, eventually blocking it. When this hungry, blocked flea next tries to feed, it regurgitates a mass of bacteria into the new bite wound, efficiently passing on the infection. When your rodent landlord, the rat, or in this case the marmot, suddenly kicks the bucket from the plague, any warm body looks like a good new apartment for these newly homeless and very hungry fleas. For centuries, perhaps millennia, this cycle of infection likely remained largely confined to these remote animal populations, causing periodic die-offs among them, what scientists call epizootics, but rarely troubling human settlements significantly. An unlucky hunter or a herder might occasionally contract the disease, a sporadic case here or there, but these wouldn't necessarily spark a wider epidemic, just a local tragedy, quickly forgotten in the vastness of the land. So what changed in the early 13th century to unleash this ancient terror upon the wider world? Several factors might have contributed. There's evidence of significant climatic shifts during this period, perhaps prolonged droughts that decimated rodent populations, forcing infected fleas to seek new hosts, including domestic animals or humans who ventured into these areas. Or maybe unusually wet periods led to an explosion in rodent numbers, increasing the density of the disease. Ecological disruptions like increased human encroachment on wild habitats for farming or hunting could have also brought people into closer and more frequent contact with these natural plague reservoirs. The exact trigger remains a subject of research, but something definitely upset that delicate balance. While Central Asia is a prime candidate, we must also look further east, to China. There are compelling Chinese historical records from the 1320s and 1330s, during the Yuan dynasty, which was incidentally a Mongol dynasty, describing outbreaks of a devastating pestilence. Chronicles speak of enormous death tolls in regions like Hebei province. For instance, some accounts claim that deaths in one area reached a horrifying 90% of the population. While medieval statistics are notoriously difficult to verify and prone to exaggeration, the sheer scale of reported suffering is undeniable. These accounts sometimes include very striking, almost apocalyptic imagery. Here's a quirky tidbit from some of those Eastern sources. Medieval Chinese chronicles describing what might have been these early plague outbreaks sometimes mention bizarre precursor events, like rains of frogs and snakes, noxious fogs, or the ground splitting open to release foul odors before the sickness took hold. Modern sensibilities might dismiss these as pure fantasy or symbolic language, but they convey the profound terror and the sense that the natural world itself had become hostile. Clearly, this was the ancient version of clickbait headlines, designed to convey just how monumentally bad the situation had become. These early outbreaks in China, devastating as they were locally, were still largely contained within its borders, or so it seemed. The vast distances and geographical barriers of Asia meant that news, let alone disease, traveled slowly. There was no Twitter back then to flash warnings like, "Plague is coming," #OMG, "Fleas on tour," "Central Asia is not having a good time."
This brings us to the crucial role of the Mongol Empire. In the 13th century, Genghis Khan and his successors had forged the largest contiguous land empire in history, a colossal territory stretching from Eastern Europe across Asia to the Pacific Ocean. While their conquests were often brutal, the establishment of Mongol rule over such a vast area led to a period known, somewhat ironically given its origins, as the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. For roughly a century, from the mid-13th to the mid-14th century, this empire imposed a surprising degree of stability and order across its domains. One of the most significant consequences of this was the flourishing of trade and travel along the ancient Silk Road. This legendary network of routes wasn't a single road, but a web of interconnected pathways, caravan trails, and sea lanes that linked China, India, and Persia with the Mediterranean world. Imagine long caravans of camels and pack horses, laden with silks, spices, porcelain, paper, gunpowder, and other precious commodities, slowly making their way across treacherous mountains and deserts. These caravans were the lifeblood of intercontinental commerce, and under the Mongols, travel became safer and more organized, with established post stations, or the yam system, and a degree of protection for merchants. They were a bit too good at creating an interconnected world, especially for fleas with an insatiable wanderlust. And so, as these caravans moved westward from plague-affected regions in China or Central Asia, they didn't just carry valuable merchandise. Unseen and uninvited, Yersinia pestis hitched a ride. Infected rats, common inhabitants of human settlements and transport, would find their way into grain sacks or onto carts. Infected fleas, clinging to the rats or to the textiles and furs being transported, became unwitting passengers. That beautiful silk scarf, so coveted in the markets of Europe, might have been brushed by a dying rat 1,000 miles away. It was, for some unfortunate souls further down the supply chain, quite literally, to die for. Mongol armies and administrators, constantly moving across the empire to maintain control or engage in further conquests, also played a significant role in disseminating the disease. They weren't deliberately spreading it in these early stages, of course. They were often its victims too. But their movements acted as vectors, carrying the infection from one region to another with an efficiency that would have been impossible in a more fragmented political landscape. Major trading cities along these routes, places like Almalik, Samarkand, Sarai, capital of the Golden Horde, and Astrakhan, became crucial nodes not only for commerce but also for the transmission of the plague. Each stop, each exchange of goods provided a fresh opportunity for the disease to leap to new hosts and new locations. The bacterium itself, Yersinia pestis, is a formidable adversary. It's a hardy organism, able to survive in different environments and hosts. While we now know it as a single species, there's still much to learn about its evolution and the specific strains that caused different historical pandemics. This leads us to an open scholarly debate. Historians and scientists still argue about the precise geographical starting point of the 14th century Black Death pandemic, with evidence pointing to various regions from the Tian Shan Mountains to the steppes of southern Russia or even further east in China, and whether it was a new, highly virulent strain that emerged or a reemergence and spread of an older strain that found new opportunities due to changing environmental and human factors. Was it a superbug variant, or was the world just uniquely vulnerable at that particular moment? The genetic clues are still being pieced together from ancient DNA extracted from plague victims. Back in your European town, you remain cocooned in blissful ignorance. News from Cathay, or the land of the Tartars, would be incredibly scarce, filtered through many intermediaries and likely dismissed as exaggerated travelers' tales if it reached you at all. The concept of a disease originating so far away and posing a direct threat to your community would be almost unthinkable. Your world is vast in its unknowns, but small in its immediate concerns. You worry about the next harvest, the local lord's temper, a sick child, or the price of salt. The idea of a microscopic organism incubated in the blood of a distant marmot, now stealthily making its way along global trade routes, is beyond the wildest imaginings of anyone you know. Yet the rumbles are growing. The plague is steadily, relentlessly marching westward, leaving a trail of death and devastation across Asia and the Middle East. It's like a slow-motion tidal wave, invisible for now, but building momentum, about to crash upon the shores of a completely unprepared Europe. The silence before the storm is deafening. If only you knew how to listen for it.
So, as those infected fleas and their unsuspecting rodent hosts are making their grand, if somewhat unhygienic tour across the vast landscapes of Asia, inching ever closer to the bustling ports of Europe, you and everyone you know are operating under a completely different set of assumptions about how illness actually works. The idea of an invisible world teeming with microscopic organisms, tiny bacteria waging war within your bloodstream, that's the stuff of pure fantasy, less believable than tales of dragons or sea monsters. Your 14th century mind, and indeed the most learned minds of your era, perceives sickness through a complex tapestry woven from ancient wisdom, observable, though often misinterpreted phenomena, and profound religious conviction. To understand the sheer helplessness and the often tragically misguided responses when the storm finally breaks, we need to immerse ourselves in how you understood the very nature of an invisible airborne terror. The absolute king of explanations, the theory that underpins most medical thought and public action when it comes to widespread disease, is the miasma theory. This is a cornerstone, a mainstream historical fact of pre-modern medicine that you'd encounter everywhere, from the pronouncements of university-trained physicians to the fearful whispers of your neighbors. Miasma, a word and concept inherited from the ancient Greeks, literally means pollution or defilement. You believe that diseases, especially those that strike down many people at once, like an epidemic, are caused by bad air, a noxious, corrupt, and invisible vapor that rises from decaying organic matter. Think of the stench of rotting animal carcasses left unburied after a battle, the foul exhalations of stagnant swamps and marshes, the reek of uncollected garbage and human waste in overcrowded city streets, or even certain winds blowing from supposedly unhealthy southern climes. Some even believed miasma could be released from the earth itself during earthquakes or volcanic eruptions. This corrupted air, when inhaled, was thought to enter your body and disrupt the delicate balance of your internal humors, leading directly to sickness. Bad smells weren't just unpleasant, they were potentially lethal. So that local tanner, whose workshop perpetually reeked of ammonia and decaying hides, in your mind, he wasn't just exceptionally stinky, he was a walking, talking public health hazard, a potential source of neighborhood-level miasmatic doom. Your primary defense against this airborne threat, therefore, is to avoid or counteract these poisonous vapors. You might carry a pomander, a small, often ornate ball or perforated container filled with aromatic substances like ambergris, musk, camphor, cloves, or dried flowers, holding it to your nose whenever you venture into a suspect area or encounter an unpleasant odor. This was the medieval equivalent of a very, very tiny and, alas, utterly ineffective personal air filter. People would burn fragrant woods like juniper, pine, or rosemary in their homes and in public squares, hoping the pleasant smoke would purify the air and drive away the miasma. Large bonfires might be lit in the streets for the same purpose. Windows would be kept shut, especially those facing prevailing bad winds, and you might be advised to avoid strenuous exercise that would cause you to breathe too deeply of the potentially corrupted atmosphere. Some even suggested that being near strong, good smells could protect you, so living near a bakery might be considered healthier than living near a butcher shop. Now, this miasma theory often worked in conjunction with the broader framework of humoral theory, another legacy of ancient Greek medicine, particularly from Galen. You believe your body contains 4 primary fluids, or humors: blood, associated with a sanguine temperament and hot and moist qualities; phlegm, phlegmatic, cold and moist; yellow bile, choleric, hot and dry; and black bile, melancholic, cold and dry. Perfect health is a state of balance among these 4 humors, a unique equilibrium for each individual. Illness arises when this balance is disturbed. Too much of one humor, not enough of another, or one of them becoming corrupted. Miasma was thought to be one of the primary external factors that could cause such a humoral imbalance. Therefore, maintaining your personal humoral balance through proper diet, exercise, but not too much, and lifestyle was considered a key preventative measure. If you were feeling a bit off, a physician might diagnose you with an excess of, say, yellow bile. The solution? Perhaps dietary changes to include more cold and moist foods, and maybe avoid too much sunshine or anger. If that didn't work, well, there were always leeches to help remove any excess hot blood. Seems legit, right? This individual constitution also explained why some people fell sick while others in the same household remained healthy. Their humoral balance was perhaps more robust or less susceptible to that particular miasmatic assault. Beyond the terrestrial and the personal, you would also look to the heavens for explanations. Astrology was not some fringe practice. It was a highly respected branch of learning, intricately linked with medicine. University-trained physicians were often also proficient astrologers. It was widely believed that the movements and conjunctions of planets had a profound influence on events on Earth, including the health of populations and the generation of miasma. Unfavorable alignments, particularly of the malefic planets like Saturn, associated with cold, death, and melancholy, and Mars, associated with heat, war, and strife, especially when in conjunction with Jupiter, which amplified effects, were often blamed for causing widespread pestilence. These celestial bodies were thought to corrupt the atmosphere, generating the deadly miasmatic vapors. In October 1348, the medical faculty of the University of Paris, one of the most prestigious in Europe, produced a famous report on the plague, attributing its primary cause to a triple conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius that had occurred at 1 p.m. on March 20, 1345. Such precise astrological calculations gave a comforting, if incorrect, sense of order and predictability to an otherwise chaotic event. Mars having a bad hair day in conjunction with Saturn? Well, there goes the neighborhood, and quite possibly half the population. Comets, eclipses, and even unusually bright stars were also scrutinized as potential omens or direct causes of earthly calamities.
Of course, overarching all these explanations was the profound belief in divine providence. For the vast majority of people in 14th century Europe, God was an active force in the world, and a devastating pestilence like the one brewing would inevitably be interpreted by many, if not most, as a sign of God's anger at humanity's sins. The collective sinfulness of mankind, greed, lechery, blasphemy, pride, was seen as provoking divine retribution. The plague could be understood as God's scourge, a terrible judgment intended to punish the wicked and recall the faithful to repentance. This belief would lead to widespread public displays of piety, prayer services, fasting, religious processions, and acts of charity, all undertaken in the hope of appeasing an offended deity. Apparently, God had a very low tolerance for humanity's medieval shenanigans, and this was his way of sending a rather strongly worded memo. What about the idea of contagion as we understand it? That disease can pass directly from a sick person to a healthy one via germs. This concept was not entirely absent, but it was muddled and not the primary explanation. People certainly observed that being near the sick or handling their belongings often resulted in falling ill oneself. They knew something was up when everyone who spent time with poor Uncle Jeffrey after he started coughing and developing those nasty swellings also got very, very sick. But the mechanism was usually attributed to the especially potent miasma emanating from the sick person's body or their breath, or perhaps to their pestilential gaze. Some believe the venom of the disease could be transmitted through the eyes. The idea of tiny, invisible living creatures being passed from one person to another or carried by insects like fleas or rats was simply not part of their conceptual toolkit. Rats were a nuisance, yes, responsible for raiding grain stores, and fleas were an itchy annoyance, a common bedfellow, but they weren't seen as vectors of apocalyptic disease. This fundamental misunderstanding would prove to be one of the most tragic elements of the unfolding catastrophe. Here's a quirky tidbit regarding how these ideas played out. Some believe that particular sounds could influence the miasmatic environment. The loud, continuous ringing of church bells, for instance, was sometimes thought to agitate the air and thus disperse or purify the noxious vapors. Conversely, other accounts suggested that certain unwholesome or dissonant sounds could attract or even generate miasma. It's a fascinating glimpse into a sensory world where sound itself was believed to have tangible effects on the invisible forces of disease. Given this intellectual framework, the efforts to combat the plague when it eventually arrived would be based on these understandings. They would try to purify the air, to balance their humors, to implore divine mercy, and to implore divine mercy. This leads to an interesting open scholarly debate. Historians still argue about the extent to which ordinary medieval people truly understood or differentiated between these learned medical theories like miasma and humoralism versus more popular folkloric beliefs or purely religious explanations for disease, and how these different belief systems interacted in their daily lives and responses to the plague. Did the average peasant in a remote village really think about planetary conjunctions? Or was their primary concern the wrath of God and the efficacy of local folk remedies handed down through generations? It was likely a blend, a complex layering of explanations as people tried to make sense of the inexplicable using all the intellectual and spiritual tools at their disposal. So, as the first infected ships unknowingly sail towards European shores, Europe is armed with a potent cocktail of theories, some philosophical, some astrological, some deeply spiritual. What it lacks is any true understanding of the biological enemy it is about to face. The invisible airborne terror they fear is a phantom of bad smells and celestial ire. The real terror is a microscopic bacterium, silently multiplying, preparing to expose the fatal flaws in their most cherished beliefs about how the world and sickness truly worked.
While you, back in Western Europe, are perhaps diligently sniffing your pomander and checking the alignment of Saturn for any ominous signs, blissfully unaware of the microscopic storm gathering far to your east, the plague isn't just a distant rumor anymore. It's about to make a very dramatic and exceptionally grim entrance onto the European stage, or at least onto its doorstep, through a single, horrifyingly memorable event. Our focus shifts now to the bustling, fortified Genoese trading emporium of Kaffa, a city nestled on the sun-drenched Crimean Peninsula, commanding a strategic position on the shores of the Black Sea. Known today as Feodosia in Ukraine, Kaffa in the mid-14th century was a prized jewel in Genoa's extensive network of maritime colonies, a vibrant multicultural hub where Italian merchants, local Tartars, Armenians, Greeks, and others mingled, trading slaves, furs, silks, spices, and grain. It was a vital link in the great chain of commerce connecting the Silk Road's overland routes with the maritime highways of the Mediterranean. Think of it as a medieval special economic zone, a place of immense wealth, fierce competition, and, as it turned out, catastrophic vulnerability. Kaffa was so commercially attractive, everyone wanted a piece of the action. The Genoese had built formidable stone walls around their enclave, a testament to both their prosperity and the often tense relations with their neighbors, particularly the Tartars of the Golden Horde, the Mongol successor state that controlled the vast Crimean hinterlands. The relationship between the Genoese traders of Kaffa and the Khans of the Golden Horde was a roller coaster of convenience and conflict. There were treaties and trade agreements, yes, but also frequent disputes over customs duties, trading rights, and the occasional violent altercation between Christian Italians and Muslim Tartars, which could escalate rapidly. In 1343, one such dispute over alleged mistreatment of Tartar merchants by the Genoese in Tana, another trading post, had led to a Mongol siege of Kaffa, which eventually fizzled out. However, tensions remained high. Fast forward to 1345-1346, and Johnny Beg, the reigning Khan of the Golden Horde, decides to lay siege to Kaffa once more, determined to oust the Genoese from this lucrative perch. So you can imagine the scene.
Within the sturdy walls of Kaffa, thousands of Genoese citizens and soldiers, along with other inhabitants, look out with trepidation at the vast encampment of the Mongol army spreading across the plains, their colorful banners snapping in the Black Sea breeze, their siege engines, powerful trebuchets, catapults, and battering rams being prepared for action. Sieges in this era were brutal, drawn-out affairs, a deadly game of attrition. The defenders would face starvation, disease, even before the disease, and the constant psychological strain of bombardment and the threat of a final bloody assault. For months, the siege grinds on. The Mongols likely employ their typical tactics, attempting to blockade the city by land and sea, though Genoese naval power often kept sea lanes open, launching projectiles to damage fortifications and terrorize the inhabitants, and possibly attempting to undermine the walls. Inside Kaffa, food supplies would be dwindling, water sources guarded jealously, and the mood growing increasingly grim. The defenders would be making sorties, repairing breaches, and praying for relief from Genoa or for the Mongols to simply give up. Then something changes dramatically, not in favor of the defenders, but with a horrifying new twist. The very plague that had been working its way westward across Asia, the unseen passenger in Mongol baggage trains and armies, erupts with ferocious intensity within the besieging Mongol camp itself. Soldiers begin to fall ill in droves, struck down by the agonizing fevers, chills, and the telltale bugers. The mighty Golden Horde, an army that had conquered vast territories, finds itself ravaged by an invisible enemy from within its own ranks. Their numbers plummet, their strength wanes, and their morale collapses. It seems the siege might have to be abandoned, a victory for Kaffa by default. But Khan Johnny Beg, or his generals, faced with this devastating turn of events, reportedly makes a decision of unprecedented barbarity. This is the moment that has been seared into the historical memory of the Black Death's arrival in Europe, a mainstream historical fact largely thanks to the vivid account written a few years later by an Italian notary from Piacenza named Gabriele de Mussi. According to Mussi, the Mongols, enraged by their losses and perhaps seeing a way to turn their own catastrophe to their advantage, decided that if they were having a miserable, plague-ridden time, it was only fair to share the experience. They began to load the corpses of their plague victims, bodies swollen, discolored, and reeking of death, onto their massive siege engines. Standard trebuchet ammunition usually included large stones, pots of Greek fire, or even dead animals to be foul water supplies. But this was a whole new category of projectile warfare. These were not just bodies, they were biological weapons. The trebuchets, with their long, powerful throwing arms, then launched these gruesome payloads high over Kaffa's formidable walls, sending them arcing through the air to land with sickening thuds inside the besieged city. The dying Tartars, stunned and stupefied by the immensity of the disaster brought about by the disease, ordered the corpses to be placed in catapults and lobbed into the city in the hope that the intolerable stench would kill everyone within, wrote Gabriele de Mussi. One can only imagine the sheer terror and revulsion of the Genoese defenders as these macabre missiles rain down upon their streets, their homes, their marketplaces. It's not exactly the kind of special delivery you'd want from your besiegers. Talk about unwelcome party favors.
The impact inside Kaffa would have been immediate and devastating, both psychologically and physically. The sight of plague-dead bodies literally falling from the sky would have shattered morale. The stench, as Demussi noted, would have been overwhelming, adding to the miasmatic fears already prevalent. And more practically, these corpses, teeming with Yersinia pestis and the fleas that carried them, would have created new foci of infection throughout the city. Water sources could have been contaminated, and the sheer proximity to so much infected material would have dramatically increased the risk of transmission to the city's inhabitants. Soon, the people of Kaffa began to sicken and die with the same horrifying symptoms that had ravaged the Mongol camp. They were trapped, with a relentless human enemy at their gates, and an even more terrifying, invisible enemy now multiplying within their walls. Now, here's a quirky tidbit about this infamous event. Gabriele de Mussi, our primary chronicler for the catapult story, was almost certainly not an eyewitness in Kaffa. He was in Italy during the siege. He likely based his dramatic account on the testimony of Genoese survivors who eventually made their way back home, tales that perhaps grew even more horrifying with each retelling. This doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it does introduce a layer of historical interpretation. It's also interesting that Demussi himself framed this act in deeply moral and religious terms, seeing it as a diabolical act that unleashed God's judgment upon the world. Even in an era accustomed to the brutalities of warfare, this particular tactic seemed to cross a line, inspiring immediate condemnation. This brings us to an important open scholarly debate. Historians and scientists continued to debate the epidemiological significance of the catapulting of bodies at Kaffa. Was this act of biological warfare the decisive event that introduced the plague into the city and subsequently to Europe? Or was the disease already present in Kaffa due to the usual comings and goings of rats and fleas between the besieged city and the Mongol camp, which was already infected? It's quite plausible that plague-infected rats, always resourceful, had already breached Kaffa's defenses long before the first corpse was launched. The catapulted bodies would have undoubtedly amplified the terror, spread panic, and perhaps accelerated the epidemic within Kaffa by creating multiple new points of infection and overwhelming any attempts at sanitation. But some argue that the intense rat and flea activity typically associated with both sieges and plague outbreaks means the disease might have found its way in regardless. The catapults, in this view, were a horrifyingly dramatic chapter, but perhaps not the sole or even primary vector for the initial infection of the city. Regardless of the precise mechanism of its intensification within the city walls, the plague raged through Kaffa. Faced with this unimaginable nightmare, an ongoing siege from without and a raging pestilence from within, the Genoese did what any sensible, terrified person would do if they had the chance. They fled. Sometime in 1347, as the situation became utterly untenable, a number of Genoese ships, perhaps a dozen or so galleys, managed to break through the Mongol blockade or negotiate a departure. These weren't triumphant fleets sailing home with riches. These were fugitive vessels, crammed with desperate survivors, merchants, sailors, and their families, many of whom were already incubating the deadly disease. Leaving Kaffa in 1347 wasn't a strategic retreat. It was more of a get me the heck out of this biological experiment gone catastrophically wrong kind of situation. Imagine the conditions on those escaping ships. Decks packed with terrified people, some already showing the horrifying symptoms of the plague, others watching their loved ones die before their eyes. Sanitation would have been non-existent. And crucially, the ship's rats, those ubiquitous companions of medieval maritime travel, would have also come along for the ride, carrying their precious cargo of infected fleas. These rats were probably the most historically significant rodents of the 14th century, getting front-row seats to a pandemic they actively helped create. Little did they know they were carrying the doom of millions in their very fur. As these ships sailed westwards out of Kaffa, out of the Black Sea, and towards the great trading hubs of Constantinople and the Mediterranean, they were no longer just merchant vessels. They were floating coffins, mobile incubators of Yersinia pestis, carrying the Black Death on its next fateful journey, directly towards an unsuspecting and tragically unprepared Europe. The grim catapults of Kaffa had done their work, directly or indirectly, and the fuse had been lit. Those fugitive Genoese galleys, having slipped the noose of the Mongol siege at Kaffa, are now desperate specters on the vast, indifferent expanse of the Black Sea. Imagine yourself aboard one of these vessels, a cramped, creaking world reeking of fear, sickness, and the faint, sweetish odor of death. The initial relief of escape has rapidly given way to a new kind of terror. The plague, that invisible stowaway from Kaffa, is now a very visible and active passenger. Day by day, more of your fellow travelers, merchants who dreamt of riches, sailors who knew every current, families who hoped for safety, succumb. The fevers, the chills, the agonizing buboes erupting on their bodies, the delirium, you witness it all in horrifying close proximity. There's nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Bodies are hastily wrapped in sailcloth and, with a muttered prayer, consigned to the dark waters, a grim trail marking your westward flight. The crew's itinerary from Kaffa was tragically basic: nonstop despair, a disturbingly high chance of developing unsightly boils, and a till-death-do-us-part commitment from your fellow passengers and their accompanying vermin. Not exactly a five-star experience, and definitely no shuffleboard tournaments. Your first major port of call after exiting the Black Sea via the Bosporus Strait would likely be the magnificent city of Constantinople, the capital of the declining but still prestigious Byzantine Empire. It's late spring or early summer in the year 1347. Constantinople,
a city that had withstood countless sieges and upheavals, a beacon of Eastern Christianity and a bustling nexus of trade routes, now faces an enemy unlike any it has known. When your ships, or others carrying the same deadly cargo from similarly afflicted Black Sea ports, limp into the Golden Horn, they bring not just sought-after goods from the east, but the seeds of an unparalleled disaster. The Byzantines had certainly seen a lot in their thousand-year history, but death ships arriving from the plague zone with highly contagious crew members was a new and particularly unwelcome addition to the imperial calendar. The Byzantine emperor himself, John VI Kantakuzenos, would later chronicle the arrival of the pestilence in his city. He described how it began in the northern regions, referring to the Black Sea area, and spread, noting its terrifying speed and lethality. His own young son, Andronicus, would perish from the disease. The historian Nicephorus Gregoras also provided accounts of the plague's devastating impact on Constantinople, describing the depopulation and the despair that gripped the city. Initially, the sick sailors and merchants disembarking might have sought aid or simply mingled with the populace, unaware of the full extent of the danger they carried. But soon, the telltale symptoms begin to appear among the residents of Constantinople's crowded quarters. The disease, finding a fresh, dense population, rips through the ancient capital, leaving a trail of devastation. The city, which had once been the most populous in Christendom, sees its numbers drastically reduced. The plague doesn't pause for imperial grandeur or ancient lineage. It strikes all. From Constantinople, the tendrils of the infection likely spread to other Aegean islands and coastal towns in Greece and Anatolia, carried by the constant maritime traffic that characterized the eastern Mediterranean. But the main current of the westward-bound plague fleet, those Genoese galleys from Kaffa, continues its grim voyage. They sail through the Dardanelles, across the Aegean Sea, past the myriad Greek islands, rounding the Peloponnese, and into the Ionian Sea. Then northward through the strait that separates Sicily from the Italian mainland. Their destination? Messina, a key Sicilian port, a vital hub for Mediterranean trade. And so, we arrive at the moment enshrined in most history books as the Black Death's formal, terrifying debut in Western Europe. It's October 1347. Picture the harbor of Messina, a sickle-shaped bay bustling with its usual maritime clamor. Ships from all over the Mediterranean are docked, loading and unloading goods. Sicilian grain, wine, citrus fruits, alongside wares from the Levant and North Africa. Local fishermen mend their nets, merchants haggle loudly on the quays, and children dart through the crowds. You, as an inhabitant of Messina, are accustomed to this vibrant, international scene. Then, a group of 12 Genoese trading galleys sails into view and drops anchor. Their arrival itself is unusual. Genoese ships are common visitors. But there's something terribly wrong with these particular vessels.
As they draw closer, an eerie silence hangs over some of them. On others, gaunt, spectral figures can be seen on deck, some barely able to stand. When the first sailors make their way ashore, or when port officials go aboard, the full horror is revealed. Many of the crew are already dead, lying in their bunks or on the decks. Those still alive are in the throes of a terrifying illness, burning with fever, racked with pain, and marked by the gavacholi, the dark, swollen duboes in their groins, armpits, and necks, which would become the plague's most infamous signature. Michael of Piazza, a Franciscan friar living in Sicily at the time, left a chilling eyewitness account. He wrote that these Genoese sailors carried such a disease in their bodies that if anyone so much as spoke with them, he was infected with the deadly illness and could not avoid death. He described how the disease showed itself by boils in the groin or under the armpits, some of which grew to the size of an ordinary apple, others like an egg. When the ships arrived in Messina, the locals were probably expecting exotic silks and fragrant spices, not a boatload of pure agony and a communicable disease with a really bad attitude and an apparent desire to meet everyone personally. The reaction in Messina is one of instant and overwhelming terror. Initial curiosity likely turned to revulsion and panic as the nature and deadliness of the sickness became apparent. The city authorities, realizing these ships are carriers of a deadly pestilence, tried to take action. They attempt to expel the Genoese galleys from the harbor to quarantine them, but it's far too late.
The rats, those ever-present companions of seagoing vessels and tiny furry harbingers of doom, had almost certainly already scampered ashore, carrying their infected fleas into the warehouses, homes, and alleys of Messina. And sick sailors, desperate for help, had already interacted with the local population. Messina tried to tell the Genoese ships, "Sorry, we're all full up on pestilence today, perhaps try the next port down the coast," but the plague, as you might imagine, wasn't really taking no for an answer. The disease erupts in Messina with horrifying speed and ferocity. Friar Michael describes how the Messinese, terrified by the scourge, when they realized that this sudden death came from contact with the Genoese and their belongings, drove them from the city and the port with all speed. But the plague is already loose. It spreads like wildfire through the densely packed city. Friends abandon friends. Families abandon their sick. Priests feared to give last rites. The city becomes a place of death and despair. Those who can flee inland, carrying the disease with them into the Sicilian countryside, ensuring its spread throughout the island. From Sicily, the plague makes the short jump across the Strait of Messina to Reggio Calabria on the Italian mainland, and then begins its relentless march northward. Around the same time, or very shortly thereafter, other infected ships, perhaps some of those same Kaffa galleys or others that picked up the infection at other eastern Mediterranean ports, arrive at other major Italian maritime centers. Genoa, the home port of the Kaffa traders, is hit hard, a grim irony. Venice, the other great Italian maritime republic and Genoa's commercial rival, also succumbs, its extensive trade network now a conduit for death. Pisa, another major port, is similarly afflicted. The plague spread through these bustling, wealthy, and crowded port cities faster than juicy gossip at a medieval sewing circle. One minute you're out haggling for the price of fish or complaining about taxes, the next you're a statistic in a rapidly escalating public health crisis. Marseille, a key port in southern France, also reports the arrival of the plague around November 1347 or January 1348, likely brought by ships from the east or from infected Italian ports. The pattern is chillingly consistent. Ships arrive, sailors are sick or dying, the disease jumps ashore, and a new epicenter of infection is born. This leads to the ongoing open scholarly debate. Historians still debate the exact number and routes of the initial ships that brought the plague to Europe and whether Messina was truly the single primary entry point for Western Europe, or if multiple infected ships made landfall in various Mediterranean ports like Genoa, Venice, and Marseille almost simultaneously, leading to several independent outbreaks that quickly coalesced into a wider pandemic. The evidence suggests a multi-pronged assault rather than a single beachhead. It's as if the plague, having traveled so far, decided to make several grand entrances at once. One quirky and terrifying motif that arose during this time was the tale of ghost ships. These were vessels that reportedly drifted aimlessly into harbors, their sails tattered, their entire crews dead from the plague, silent, macabre heralds of the doom to come. Whether these stories were entirely literal or heightened by fear, they captured the profound horror of a disease that could annihilate an entire ship's company and arrive unannounced, a floating coffin delivering death to an unsuspecting shore. Some port authorities, in desperate and usually futile attempts at a medieval form of naval quarantine, would try to use signal fires to warn off suspicious vessels or even send armed patrols in smaller boats to prevent them from docking. But the plague, unseen, insidious, and already ashore in the bodies of rats and the first infected humans, had landed. The docks of Europe, once symbols of prosperity and connection, had become its gateways to a continent-wide charnel house.
The plague, having made its dramatic and unwelcome landing at Europe's southern docks, as we've just recounted, now begins its intimate and terrifying work within the bodies of those unfortunate enough to encounter it. The Gavoculi of Messina were just the first horrifying calling cards. As the disease infiltrates towns and villages, moving inland from those initial coastal footholds, you, your family, your neighbors are now confronted not just with a spreading panic, but with the horrifying betrayal of your own physical form. Imagine that dawning, sickening realization, a sudden weariness you can't shake, a prickling heat under your skin, a creeping dread that this is more than just a common chill or a passing fever. The onset is often shockingly swift. You might wake feeling perfectly healthy, go about your morning chores,
and then by midday be seized by an inexplicable fatigue. A headache might begin to throb at your temples. A strange coldness might seep into your bones even on a warm day, quickly followed by a raging fever that leaves you shivering and sweating simultaneously. Your muscles ache, your joints protest, and a profound weakness makes even the simplest movement an ordeal. This sudden, brutal assault on your body, turning you from a functioning person into a helpless invalid in a matter of hours, is terrifying in itself. For people who understood their bodies as a delicate balance of humors, this rapid descent into chaos felt like an aggressive, almost demonic internal siege. The most commonly described manifestation, the one that has become almost synonymous with the Black Death, is of course the bubonic plague. This is where those infamous buboes make their appearance, and they weren't just painful, they were like unwelcome, rapidly inflating party balloons showing up in all the most inconvenient and sensitive places. Your body's way of essentially screaming, "Surprise! You're hideously, terrifyingly doomed." These are actually your lymph nodes, overwhelmed by the Yersinia pestis bacteria, swelling to grotesque proportions. They typically appear in the groin, the armpits, or on the neck, often corresponding to the area where an infected flea might have bitten you. These swellings, the gavocelli, as the Italians called them, can grow from the size of a hazelnut to that of an apple or even a small orange. They are initially hard, hot, and exquisitely painful to the touch. As the days pass, if you survive that long, they might soften, change color, turning reddish, then purplish, then black, and sometimes rupture, oozing pus and infected blood. The sight and smell of these suppurating buboes would add another layer of horror and despair for both you and anyone unfortunate enough to be caring for you. Alongside the buboes, the fever intensifies, often leading to delirium. You might toss and turn, muttering incoherently, seeing visions, or experiencing terrifying hallucinations. Prostration is extreme. You're utterly spent, unable to move or care for yourself. Internal hemorrhaging can occur, leading to dark bruise-like patches appearing on your skin, the so-called tokens or God's tokens, which were seen as a virtually certain sign of impending death. If the bubonic plague was to prove fatal, death usually occurred within 3 to 7 days of the first symptoms, a terrifyingly short window from health to the grave. The mortality rate for this form, in the absence of any effective treatment, was devastatingly high, perhaps 50 to 80%. But Yersinia pestis was a versatile and cruel adversary, capable of manifesting in even more aggressive forms. There was pneumonic plague, a version that settled directly in your lungs. If you contracted this form, perhaps by inhaling infected droplets coughed or sneezed out by someone already suffering from it, the onset was even more rapid and the prognosis grimmer still. You develop a searing fever, a racking cough that produced frothy, blood-tinged sputum, intense chest pains, and increasing difficulty breathing until every gasp became an agonizing struggle. Pneumonic plague was the terrifying express lane to the afterlife. No waiting around for buboes to develop, no fuss, just a cough, a desperate wheeze, and then, well, you'd be saying hello to your ancestors, likely within 1 to 3 days. Its direct person-to-person transmission through the air would have made it seem like the miasma theory, that belief in disease carried on foul air, was chillingly accurate even if the underlying mechanism was entirely misunderstood. This form was almost universally fatal. Then there was septicemic plague, perhaps the most terrifying of all for its sheer speed. In this variant, the Yersinia pestis bacteria overwhelm your bloodstream directly and massively. You might experience an incredibly high fever, extreme weakness, and a rapid descent into shock. Sometimes widespread hemorrhaging beneath your skin would cause large areas to turn dark purple or black, leading to the ghastly appearance that might have contributed to the name Black Death. This often happened so quickly that buboes didn't even have time to form. You could genuinely be feeling relatively well in the morning and be dead by nightfall. Septicemic plague was so fast, you barely had time to update your will, let alone figure out what hit you. 1 minute you're perfectly fine, the next, you're, well, very, very not fine. Its mortality rate was virtually 100%, often within 24 hours.
Faced with this horrifying onslaught,
This complete betrayal by your own body, what could you or the learned physicians of your time possibly do? The answer, as we've touched upon, was tragically little that offered any real hope. Medieval medicine, for all its ancient pedigree and elaborate theories, was utterly outmatched. Physicians, adhering to Galenic humoral theory, would assess your condition and try to rebalance those disturbed humors. Bloodletting was a near-universal treatment. A vein would be opened, often at the elbow or near the affected area if boobums were present, and a quantity of your blood, already compromised and fighting a losing battle, would be drained into a bowl. The doctor's motto sometimes seemed to be, "Feeling ill? You've probably got far too much, well, everything. Let's just drain some of that pesky blood out, shall we? You'll be right as rain. Or, possibly dead. It's really a 50-50 shot with these things." Of course, this only weakened you further, reducing your body's already faltering ability to fight. Purging was another common approach. Potent emetics made from herbs like hellebore might be administered to induce violent vomiting, or strong laxatives and enemas given to cleanse your bowels, all in an attempt to expel the corrupt humors or poisons. For the buboes themselves, if a physician was brave enough to get close, they might try lancing them with a scalpel, an excruciatingly painful procedure without anesthesia, and one that risked spreading the infection further, or applying various poultices. These could be made from figs and cooked onions mixed with yeast and butter, or more esoteric ingredients like lily roots, mallow, or even substances intended to draw out the venom through sympathetic magic. Complex pharmaceuticals were also prescribed if you had the means. Theriac, that ancient cure-all, was in high demand. This elaborate concoction, whose recipe could include dozens, sometimes over 60 ingredients, including viper's flesh, opium, cinnamon, myrrh, and a host of rare herbs and minerals, and probably unicorn horn shavings if they could find any, was painstakingly prepared and aged. It was the ultimate medieval multivitamin, guaranteed to cure everything from a mild cough to, well, the end of the world, or at least make you forget you were sick for a while thanks to the opium. While it offered no real benefit against Yersinia pestis, the psychological comfort of receiving such an expensive and revered medicine might have been significant, if fleeting. Beyond the efforts of university-trained physicians, a vast array of folk remedies and religious appeals would be employed. Here's a quirky and rather grim tidbit. Desperate times called for desperate poultry, it seems. One widely circulated cure involved taking a live, healthy chicken, plucking the feathers from its backside, and strapping it directly onto a plague bubo. The theory was that the chicken would draw the venom out of the sore. If the chicken sickened and died, which under such circumstances it often did, it was taken as a sign that the treatment was working, and another chicken would be applied. The poor chickens, presumably, were less than enthusiastic about their role in these medieval medical experiments. Other animal-based remedies included using dried toads, believed to absorb poison, or applying pigeon's blood. Some people even resorted to drinking their own urine, or potions containing powdered gold or crushed emeralds, believing these precious substances held powerful curative properties. Spiritually, you would cling to your faith. Prayers to God, the Virgin Mary, and specific plague saints like Saint Roch, who famously bared his own plague bubo, and Saint Sebastian, often depicted pierced with arrows, symbolizing protection from plague, which was sometimes called God's arrows, were constant. Confession of sins and receiving the last rites were paramount for ensuring a good death and the salvation of your soul, though finding a priest brave enough to minister to the dying became increasingly difficult as clergy members themselves succumbed at high rates. This leads to an important open scholarly debate. Historians and medical paleopathologists still debate the relative prevalence and impact of the different forms of plague, bubonic, pneumonic, or septicemic, in the Black Death pandemic. While bubonic was the most commonly described,
Was the incredibly swift and deadly pneumonic or septicemic form more responsible for the sheer speed of depopulation in certain areas? Or did other concurrent diseases, perhaps endemic fevers or dysentery, exacerbate the situation and contribute to the extremely high mortality rates? Or was Yersinia pestis alone, in its varied manifestations, responsible for the full spectrum of this unparalleled devastation? The truth is likely complex, a maelstrom of infection and vulnerability. Ultimately, every remedy, every prayer, every desperate gambit proved futile against the relentless advance of the disease within your body. The betrayal was absolute. Health, strength, and life itself were snatched away with horrifying speed, leaving behind only terror, grief, and a profound sense of bewildered helplessness in the face of an enemy that could neither be understood nor overcome.
The sheer, unmitigated horror of watching your own body or the bodies of your loved ones succumb to the grotesque betrayals we've just explored, the fevers, the erupting buboes, the swift march towards death, this was not an isolated tragedy. It was repeated in house after house, street after street, town after town, with a relentless, bewildering speed. As the plague digs its claws deeper into Europe, the fabric of your society, the very warp and weft of daily life and communal bonds begins to unravel with terrifying haste. The individual nightmare now becomes a collective one, and the streets, once alive with the familiar rhythms of medieval life, transform into echoing chambers of fear and despair. Imagine, if you can, the sheer scale of the dying. In many towns and cities, the death toll wasn't a trickle, it was a deluge. Chroniclers from the period speak of hundreds perishing each day in major urban centers like Florence, Paris, or London once the pestilence took firm hold. The existing graveyards, often small plots attached to parish churches, filled up with shocking rapidity. The normal rituals of death, the family vigil, the careful washing and shrouding of the body, the solemn funeral procession, the individual grave dug with care and marked with a prayer, all these became impossible luxuries. There simply weren't enough healthy people left to perform these duties, nor enough consecrated ground to receive the endless stream of corpses. This leads to a stark and grim mainstream historical fact. The Black Death necessitated the creation of mass plague pits. Huge trenches would be hastily dug outside town walls or in any available open space, and into these the bodies would be thrown, often unceremoniously, by the cartload. Men, women, children, rich and poor, all intermingled in a horrifying testament to their shared fate. Agnolo di Chura, a chronicler from Siena, Italy, wrote with heartbreaking starkness, "And I, Agnolo di Chura, buried my 5 children with my own hands, and so many died that all believed it was the end of the world." The air in such places would be thick not just with the perceived miasma of disease, but with the tangible stench of decomposition, a constant, grim reminder of mortality. Faced with such overwhelming and seemingly inescapable death, one of the most immediate and widespread human reactions was flight. As it became chillingly clear that this was no ordinary sickness, that proximity to the afflicted meant an almost certain death sentence, those who had the means began to flee. You'd see the wealthy packing their most precious belongings onto carts and horses, abandoning their city mansions for their country estates, hoping that the cleaner air and sparser populations of rural areas would offer sanctuary. Some clergy, physicians, those who hadn't already succumbed or weren't resolutely staying at their posts, and even civic officials joined this exodus. The motto of many became, if you can't beat 'em or understand 'em, then run away from 'em really, really fast. Bonus points, tragically, if you were already incubating the disease and unknowingly carried it with you, spreading it to a previously untouched village. Whoops! This flight of the affluent and the able often left the towns and cities bereft not only of their wealthier citizens, but also of leadership and essential skills, further crippling the community's ability to cope. But flight was a luxury not available to all. The vast majority, the poor, the laborers, those tied to the land or to their crafts with no country estate to escape to, were left behind to face the storm.
And it's within these trapped populations that the most heart-wrenching breakdowns of social bonds occurred. Giovanni Boccaccio, in the introduction to his Decameron, provides a vivid and haunting account to Florence in 1348. He describes how brother abandoned brother, nephew his uncle, sister her brother, and in many cases, wife her husband. Nay, what is more, and scarcely to be believed, fathers and mothers were found to abandon their own children, untended, unvisited, to their fate as if they had been strangers. It's a chilling depiction of familial ties dissolving in the acid of terror. This abandonment wasn't necessarily born of inherent cruelty, but of an overwhelming primal fear of contagion. Tending to a loved one with the plague was akin to signing your own death warrant. The agonizing choice between self-preservation and the deepest human instincts of care and compassion tore families and communities apart. Suddenly, "Till death do us part" took on a much shorter and far more literal timeline when your spouse started developing those telltale buboes. This fear and the sheer number of sick and dying led to a catastrophic breakdown in essential services. Who would maintain law and order when the town watchmen themselves were falling ill or had fled? Courts of law often ceased to function. Markets, the lifeblood of urban economies, dwindled or closed entirely as merchants died, fled, or simply feared to venture out. This, in turn, could lead to food shortages, exacerbating the misery. In the countryside, fields lay untilled, crops unharvested, because the peasants who worked them were dead or dying. Workshops in towns fell silent. The clanging of the blacksmith's hammer, the whirring of the weaver's loom faded away. It must have felt like the world itself was grinding to a halt. You might wander through your town, once so vibrant, and find it eerily deserted, a ghost of its former self. It was probably a great time to find a prime parking spot for your donkey in downtown Florence if you were so inclined. The significant downside, of course, was that most of end shops were closed due to, the minor inconvenience of everyone being either dead or having sprinted for the hills in abject terror. The psychological atmosphere was one of almost unremitting terror and despair. Many truly believed they were witnessing the apocalypse, the end of days, as foretold in Scripture. The sheer inexplicability of the plague, its relentless ferocity, its seeming indifference to age, status, or piety, shook people's faith in the established order of the world, both natural and divine. Superstition flourished alongside fervent religiosity. Rumors spread like wildfire of monstrous births, of strange celestial signs, of shadowy figures seen spreading the pestilence. The air itself, that miasma you already feared, now seemed palpably thick with death. One quirky tidbit reflecting this oppressive atmosphere comes from Boccaccio, who describes how some people would carry bunches of flowers or fragrant herbs and spices, pressing them to their noses not just to ward off miasma, but simply to make the overwhelming stench of death that permeated many areas even remotely bearable. Others, conversely, avoided anything pleasant or aromatic, fearing that such things would open the pores of the body and make them more susceptible to the plague-laden air. Their idea of social distancing was less about maintaining 6 feet of separation and more about seeing a town in the distance and deciding, "Nope, let's not go there, ever." Or if someone nearby let out a suspicious cough, you didn't just politely step back, you considered running for the next county line, a perfectly reasonable response. Yet human responses were not uniformly bleak. Amidst the terror and breakdown, there were also extraordinary acts of courage, compassion, and resilience. Some priests and friars, true to their vows, stayed to minister to the sick and dying, offering spiritual comfort at immense personal risk, and many paid the ultimate price. Nurses, often women from religious orders or simply ordinary laywomen, tended to the afflicted with little hope of reward and a high likelihood of infection. Neighbors helped neighbors, sharing dwindling food supplies or caring for orphan children. And while some abandoned their posts, other civic leaders and officials worked tirelessly to maintain some semblance of order, to organize the burial of the dead, and to try and implement what few public health measures they could devise, however ineffective. At the other extreme, as Boccaccio also vividly describes, were those who believing their fate was sealed and the world was ending, threw off all moral restraint and abandoned themselves to hedonism. Others, he wrote, maintained to carouse and make merry and go about singing and playing and gratifying every appetite that one dictated, and to laugh and scoff at whatsoever befell was the best medicine for such a disease. These groups would roam the city, often breaking into the abandoned houses of the dead or dying to feast on their food and wine, their revelry a stark, macabre counterpoint to the surrounding desolation. Some probably figured, if the world's truly ending, might as well go out with a massive hangover and absolutely no regrets. The plague, in its own grim way, probably agreed with the no regrets part, just for entirely different and far more permanent reasons. Suddenly, you could find yourself inheriting your estranged rich uncle's grand estate much sooner than you ever anticipated. The only downside was the distinct possibility that you might also inherit his particularly tenacious fleas, and, of course, his plague. This leads to the important open scholarly debate. Historians continue to debate the extent and uniformity of this societal collapse. While some contemporary accounts, particularly those from heavily stricken Italian cities, paint a picture of near total anarchy and the dissolution of all social bonds, other evidence from different regions or smaller communities suggests that many societies maintained a surprising degree of order. Civic authorities in some places did manage to organize relief efforts, enforce rudimentary quarantine measures, and ensure the dead were buried, indicating considerable resilience alongside the undeniable chaos and despair. The reality was likely a complex mosaic, varying greatly from place to place, reflecting the diverse ways human beings respond when faced with an existential threat of unimaginable proportions. The panic on the streets was real, the fear palpable, but the human spirit, in all its varied and contradictory manifestations, was also on full display.